We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
Good morning and welcome to the Monday edition of Free Association Radio. This is Robert Phoenix. You're listening to the Monday Mashup. Happy April Fool's Day. I was thinking about doing something slightly foolish, outlandish, and crazy, but I thought that today's subject matter was foolish, outlandish, and crazy enough, as it were. Today we're going to be looking at North Korea and what's happening there. Because on some level, it is, it's laughable. I mean, it is kind of it's a Mel Brooks movie in the making. I mean, we've had countries that have theoretically threatened the United States, but without a lot of Sturm und Drang, as the Germans would say. Like there was some saber rattling, a little bit from Gaddafi, a little bit from Iraq, but it was really just kind of saber rattling, right? I mean, nobody really expected Saddam Hussein to do anything because, well, there was too much at stake. Iraq produces a lot of oil. There's people in the Middle East who are quote-unquote allies. And those allies, by the way, have been fortified over time through investment. And we're talking even small countries like Bahrain and Qatar. These are Dubai, the Arab Emirates. Lots of money has gone into those countries. And they were... They're Muslim countries, but they've tilted heavily towards the West. So while we also have our good friend Israel in the Middle East and all of these other little Arab protectorates, there's been more kind of insular influence from the West there. So even though Saddam might have been a threat, there's way too much going on. Way too much. Geopolitically, we've got bases in Turkey, we've got missiles in Turkey. We can light a cigarette, blink an eye, and take out Baghdad if we wanted to from the air. It wouldn't be that hard. I don't think anybody ever took Saddam Hussein seriously, no matter what Colin Powell or Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld. Maybe I'm wrong. I didn't. I certainly didn't. But I guess there are people that did because they bought into the lie. And so they did the same thing with Muammar Gaddafi, demonize, sanctions, call NATO troops, back the resistance, whoever the resistance might be, and voila, you have a war, you stage a coup, you overthrow a country. End of story. Did the same thing with Syria. In fact, we haven't heard anything about Bashar al-Assad. Likely he might be dead. If he's not dead, he's certainly not in a position to lead the country. There is a vacuum and a void of leadership there. Now they're positioning this Syrian dude from Texas, from the telecom industry, to be the next leader of Syria. You have to understand, Syria's been in the hands of the Assad family. Bringing somebody in from outside the family, or even from outside the country. This guy's living in Dallas. And they want to prop him up as the next leader of Syria. And that's ridiculous. So this is what happens. This is what happens in the geopolitical chess match from around the world. What are we dealing with now? We're dealing with North Korea, which is a rogue nation state. I mean, North Korea is the wild card. Why? Well, they're a wild card because, number one, hardly anybody knows anything about them. And number two, they have nothing to lose, right? They've got nothing to lose. They've got, what do they have? They have no resources whatsoever. None. They have an ally in China, but even China is sort of outpacing North Korea. I mean, China has moved on to the West. China is dominating the West economically through their strange hybrid of socialism and capitalism. North Korea is communism, and the head of that communistic state obviously is the Yang family, with the new leader, Kim Jong-un, as the head of North Korea. By the way, he's young. He's only, at the most, he's only 30 or 31. They're not sure if he was born in 83 or 84. So you have somebody, if he's born in 1984, Pluto in Scorpio, 1 degree, and he's going through his Saturn return. I mean, think about that. You've got a leader of a nation that's got nuclear weapons going through a Saturn return. To me, this is absolutely fascinating. He's born on January 8th, which puts his birthday as the same birthday as Elvis and David Bowie and R. Kelly. So January 8th, whether it's 83 or 84, it is a power day because we're dealing with the 8 energy and we're dealing with Capricorn. If he's born on the 8th of January in 84, that would give him a Pisces moon. And he would have Mercury in Capricorn, Venus in Sag, Mars in Libra, Jupiter in Sag, and Saturn in Scorpio. He would also have the aforementioned Pluto in Scorpio, and his Chiron would be in Taurus. If we go back to 83, let's look at his astrology for 1983, just so we can get a handle on this guy. What's happening with him? We're gonna rectify Kim Jong-un. I think it's interesting too that we had this flare up with North Korea right after Dennis Rodman went there. Anybody notice that? Dennis Rodman goes there, parties with the guy, watches the Harlem Globetrotters, and then all of a sudden, all hell starts breaking loose with Kim Jong-un threatening New York, Los Angeles, and where I live, Austin, Texas. Maybe he doesn't like Alex Jones. Maybe that's it. I learned over the weekend that Glenn Beck is here, by the way. I'm thinking that Mr. Jong-un is probably born in 1983. Just looking at the chart. Just looking at the solar chart. This feels more like his chart, which places his Pluto at the anaretic degree of 29 Libra. He should be making peace, not threats. He's got his Chiron in Taurus. Maybe he has a really small member. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's why he's doing all of this. Saturn in Scorpio, no doubt he is going through his Saturn return. It's always great to see a world leader with nuclear weapons go through their Saturn return on our time. Heaven help us on that. And he's got a bunch of stuff in Aquarius, because I think this is where we see the young magic at play here. He's got Mercury retrograde in Aquarius. So Mercury retrograde is revolutionary, but it's revolutionary for all the wrong reasons, right? He's got Venus in Aquarius and Mars in Aquarius. So these are all fixed signs, or they're all in the fixed sign of Aquarius. So this guy may not be bluffy. He might actually really be up to something. And I'm not putting that out there because I want to scare people, but because when you look at all this Aquarius, and if his moon is indeed in Scorpio, that's another fixed sign. And he's got Chiron in Taurus, another fixed sign. So he's got fixed energy, Saturn in Scorpio all over the place in the chart. And then moon in Scorpio it's the worst place for the moon. And I hope I'm not offending anybody with moon in Scorpio out there in radio land. It's just a tough place for the moon. There is a real jealousy factor that comes into play. So if he's dealing with a jealousy in terms of South Korea, its relationship with the West and G20 and all the goodies that South Korea gets. There's a Samsung plant here in Austin, which is maybe why he's targeted Austin, because he's got that Scorpio moon. But based on this chart, I can see the megalomaniacal energy with all of that Aquarius, Mars and Aquarius. I mean, you have to understand that Aquarius is driven by ideals. It is driven by an ideal, a revolutionary ideal, and it doesn't like to be pushed around. So, again, I'm not looking at this from what I necessarily know about North Korea, because it's a pretty mysterious place. We allow these puppet dictators to exist for a long time because it helps the military defense industry. We get to make weapons because bad guys exist in the world. Okay? Think about that. The Kim Jong-uns, the Ahmadinejads, the Assads, all these cats, they've got posters of them at Raytheon, in Rand, in McDonnell Douglas. They got posters of them all over the place. Those are the guys that drive their business every single year. They should send those guys Christmas bonuses every year. That's what they should do. We know you're a Muslim. We know you're a communist, but this has been a banner year for us here at Raytheon. Thank you. Here's a little token of our appreciation. Stay bad, your boys at Raytheon Corp. That's what they should do. Because without these guys, there would be no business. Without the bad guys, without the boogeymen, these companies would go away. And here's the part that is troubling. Because once the bad guys go away, then what happens to the military-industrial complex? This is the $64 million question. Let's just do our little checklist here. Saddam Hussein gone. Hosni Mubarak wasn't a bad guy, but wasn't a great guy either. Was he the boogeyman to the U.S.? No. He did pretty much everything the U.S. asked him to do. He even had a very brutal Secret Service, the Savak, who terrorized the populace who wanted any kind of change. Brutal. He was America's henchman in the Middle East, guarding the interests of the Suez Canal, both for Egypt and Israel and the United States. And he did it after, God, man, I'm spacing out on his name now. Sadat was murdered. He was the guy that stepped in after Sadat, and he was there until, well, 2 years ago, right? So he's gone. Who's in charge? Muslim Brotherhood. Talk about regressive. Notice how the Muslim Brotherhood has stepped in almost every country. Most people know that Muslim Brotherhood is MI6. So then we have Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, the actor formerly known as Muammar Gaddafi. He's gone. All the hopes, dreams, wishes of Libya, all their gold, all of his strikingly... I want to know what happened to his guard. He had all those really sexy, dangerous women that guarded him. They're gone. Where did they go? So cross Egypt off the list, cross Libya off the list, and of course you've got these lesser coups, Tunisia, cross them off, Yemen, cross that off the list. Now Syria, cross them off the list. Oh, see you later, Hugo Chavez, cross him off the list. You see where all this is going now, right? Who does that leave? Well, it leaves essentially two countries that were part of the axis of evil. That's Iran and North Korea. Now, some people say, well, you could throw Cuba into that mix. I don't at all. I believe Castro is dead. I think Castro died probably 5 to 6 years ago, and his brother Raul Castro has been running the country. And quite frankly, they've got a nice little thing going there down in Cuba. They don't need to flip the script. Guantanamo is happening. They want to expand Guantanamo because the infrastructure is crumbling. They've asked for billions of dollars to keep Guantanamo not just in check, but to grow it and expand. I mean, that's insane if you ask me. I mean, the United States has an army base in a country that's communist and that nobody from the United States is allowed to go to, unless, of course, you work for the United States Army, in which case you can go there. Try that on for size. A country we have no trade alliance with, but we happen to have an army base there. And we happen to have a prison that we send international criminals to. So it really comes down to Korea and Iran. These are the last outposts of true villainy because they are outside of the New World Order. Syria, not quite there yet. Give it some time. Doubtful that Assad pulls through, if he's even alive at this point. So it comes down to these two countries. You see where all this is going. They're making this push to bring all the countries of the world into one unified field, one world order. Only two countries left, not part of it, theoretically. I mean, Venezuela is not part of it. Give them time. They'll slip in one of their cronies. This is how it happens. And pretty soon the people of Venezuela are going to be under the yoke of some other type of governance besides the one that they were used to, which apparently gave them a pretty decent standard of living. Sure, there are a lot of wealthy people in Venezuela, don't get me wrong, but I think that the non-wealthy had a pretty fair shake. I mean, you're always going to find complainers, no matter where you are. Doesn't matter what the situation is. Even in the best of environments, people will complain. That's part of the human experience. That's part of being on Earth, being ungrateful. So, anyway, we have to deal with this guy on some level, right? I mean, the threat is kind of real in a very strange way. They've got nuclear weapons. Now, I tried to do a little bit of math around this on Facebook because let's just say they decide to launch their nuclear weapons. All right, there's a missile shield located in Alaska, Washington State, California, Hawaii, all part of the West Coast of the United States, which theoretically, given enough time, could take those missiles out. There would be like stations, right? Like the first wave of defense would probably come from Hawaii, Alaska. Second wave of defense would come from California. So let's just say, for instance, they decide to do this, fire off one of their missiles, two of their missiles, three of their missiles, because if you are going to fire missiles, what you want to do you want to send missiles not to one area, you want to send them to multiple areas, because then you'd have to, the country that was countering would have to then use their missile defense systems and spread them out, which means that perhaps one of those missiles could get through. Basic nuclear deployment strategy 101, right? So I still think that there was a good chance that it can't happen. So then what? Well, then you open up, if you're Kim Jong-un, you've shot your wad, well, guess what? You just have American fighter planes going in, and they bomb your capital and, fire nukes and set up drones, and you're wiped out. So it's insane. But here's the deal, right? I mean, there's nothing there to lose. The only thing that's there, and for the United States, the only thing that's there to gain would be potentially to bring in Halliburton, or Bechtel, so that once you bomb the shit out of North Korea, you go and rebuild it. Now you've got all these government contracts and all this money, and you know the story. This is what happens. It's disaster capitalism. The big piece here, though, is South Korea, because in South Korea, there's army bases, there's a huge American influence, there's all kinds of factories, cars are made there, computers are made there, phones are made there. LG and Samsung have risen to the top of their field in terms of the production and manufacture of computers and personal computing and tablets and phones and you name it, TVs, huge. So there is the potential threat to the infrastructure in South Korea, which serves Western interests a great deal. But the whole thing is completely and utterly insane. It's insane. And one of the reasons it's insane is because if we go back in time, if we go far enough back in time and we look at the Korean War, and this is kind of an outgrowth of the work that I've been doing last week on Nicholas Roerich and Henry Wallace and Harry Truman. The Korean War was Harry Truman's war. Harry Truman inherited World War II, and he kept it going long enough, especially in Japan, so that they could develop the hell bomb and then drop it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then, very quickly, after that occurred, the Korean War started. And the Korean War is the forgotten war of America. And it is really the sort of the gateway or the portal to what takes place in Vietnam a few years later. And we were talking about this on last Monday's show with Charles Frith, and one of the things that happened was that North Korea had to receive parts. They had to receive goods in order to manufacture the weaponry, the communication systems, anything that was related to fighting a war. They had nothing, so they had to receive those things. And where did they get those things? They got them from the United States. The United States packaged and shipped all these parts and goods to Russia, and Russia then assembled them there in Russia and then sold them to North Korea. So we were empowering the North Koreans to fight against ourselves. And did we know that at the time? Absolutely. Absolutely. And here's where the insanity of war comes into play. Why? Because the military-industrial complex wanted those contracts. They wanted to create all those pieces. Why? Because who feeds them? You and I feed them through our taxes. It's the best business to be in the world outside of the Federal Reserve, where you print your own money. All you've got to do is make these weapons, and you've got an automatic trough of cash flowing to you through the federal government from the United States of America, the citizenry. And that doesn't discount or cut off the sales of weapons to other countries. It's a huge business. We get to sell things to ourselves, and we get to sell things to other countries. We get to arm them against ourselves. It's a huge Ponzi scheme. So what's happening now is Kim Jong-un is firing up the war machine. Hey, we need this, we need this. But there's a danger here, and the danger is that once Kim Jong-un is theoretically removed, and he's in a precarious state right now because North Korea has nothing, and now they've got sanctions. They have sanctions being heaped upon them, and since they have nothing, they're going to get even less, right? This is a country that doesn't produce a lot of food. They have really no, national product. They've got no oil. The populace is extremely poor. Throw sanctions on top of an already beleaguered economy and people, and you've got a recipe for desperation. So as I mentioned before, they have nothing to lose. But we also know that when sanctions come along, and I've broken this down before, the anatomy of a coup goes like this. Identify the figurehead as being dangerous, right? And that danger can have a couple of different faces. The danger can be from within. Like, for instance, Saddam Hussein was a threat from without, but he was more of a threat from within, or at least that's how they sold him, right? That he was gassing babies. And that's really what, Saddam Hussein gassed a hospital where the kids, the young babies were, right? So, these was it Kurds or whoever it was. Saddam Hussein was a villain, and it was what we found out about all that testimony that got people all fired up about Saddam Hussein was that the young woman who claimed to have witnessed this was the daughter of an Iraqi businessman who had extremely strong ties with Rumsfeld and Cheney and all those cats. So people were completely duped, and the story was a lie. But that's what they did. They demonized him. He's a devil. He does this to babies. He does this to women, blah, 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 blah. And so then what do we have? Well, then we have sanctions. Sanctions are crippling. They can be really crippling. I mean, if you can't get aid or you can't have trade with other countries, because it's not just the United States, you've got NATO countries chiming in now on sanctions, you're screwed. If you don't have the infrastructure to sustain your entire economy, you're in trouble. And what happens when there's sanctions? Well, what happens when there's sanctions is that people get hungry, right? They get hungry, and the first thing they do is they look around and say, hey, we're hungry. Why do we have sanctions? Oh, it's because of that guy. So then they start to riot, and of course, there are people inside already that are there that have, their personal computing devices now, and they can get on with their cell phones. They can get on Twitter or Facebook, and they can launch a color revolution right from their personal computing device or personal media device. This is what happens. Now you have people that are angry, they're upset, they want to protest. It's the guy who is being demonized as the guy that is on the receiving end of the sanctions. And then you've got these agents provocateurs on the inside, fanning the flames of insurrection and revolution. And bang, you've got a problem on your hands if you're that country. Some countries, that can happen. It happened in Egypt. They were trying to make it happen in Syria. It didn't really happen in Libya, although they tried to make it happen. And that's when you have this infusion of troops, and you've got this liberation army, quote unquote. Now, this is how it all takes place: sanctions, desperation, demonstrations, riots, insurrection, revolution, provoked by agents provocateurs, which now we have the the NATO army coming through, and boom, you've got a full-scale overthrow of a government, all engineered. That is the blueprint. We're at the sanctions phase now in North Korea. The difference with North Korea over any of these countries is that they had nothing to begin with anyway. So they're going to have less of nothing. And the other thing is that the ability to penetrate the veil of North Korea with activists and, because a lot of those borders are open. I wouldn't say they're open, but you could get to Syria from other countries. You could get to Libya from other countries in North Africa. You could flood Egypt from the North African side. You could also flood it from the Suez Canal side. But North Korea is a whole different kettle of fish. On one side, it's got the ocean. On the other side, it's got China. And on the other side, it's got South Korea. So the borders are much more controlled there, which is why, in a weird way, it is really much more of a threat than any of those other countries. Because I don't think the normal playbook can take place with North Korea. And that is given that this is actually a real deal, right? That we're dealing with a real madman, theoretically, or a guy who won't bow to the pressures of the United States to be drawn into the New World Order. If all this is real on that level, then we're going to see something very different. This will not be a color revolution coup in the same way that we've seen in North Africa and the Middle East. This won't be. Now, there's the potential that this is a charade. There's a potential for that. And as a result of that, we got a whole different set of variables. And those variables are, they're a little freaky, to say the least. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit of music, and when I come back, we're going to get into some of those variables and what they might be. I've gotten a lot of really good response from a man called Clay's latest track, Umek, and I'm going to play that right now. I'm going to try to bring Clay on the show on Friday. We're going to do this one of these days, and we're going to talk about his music. But until then, let's listen to Umek. It's a really cool track, and I'll be back in just under 5 minutes, and we'll get into what happens if Kim Jong-un is part of something a little more sinister than we understand at this point in time. Here's a man called Clay Umek. That was a man called Clay and UMEC from his new album, which is, I believe, available on iTunes, called Ring-ing. And you can hear more of him on SoundCloud. One of the things that I wanted to do before we kind of go to the surreal alter endgame with North Korea is to just kind of look back a little bit on how it got to the how we got to this place with Korea. And obviously it happens with the Korean War. And it's a very strange war indeed. And this is the from Wikipedia. And this was we've already established that this was Harry Truman's war. Okay. And it started as a police action. This is why it's connected to Vietnam, because they were working out this new form of war. They had the United Nations, which was freshly hatched then, and was they wanted to use the muscle of the United Nations. The United Nations before that had been the League of Nations. And they launched it as a police action. And the other name for the Korean War is also the Unknown War because of the lack of public attention it received both during and after the war. People were tired of war. We just come out of World War II. But they had gone into Japan, they had subjugated Japan at that point in time, and were in their rebuild of Japan, and they wanted to keep going. So the Korean War started on June of 1950 and lasted 3 years. Well, it didn't really end. Still open. Of July, 27th of July, 1953. And here what's fascinating about the Korean War and the Korean experience. Because in 1945, this was even before the war started, 1945 to 1959, Korea was divided. This took place at the Potsdam Conference in July-August of 1945. The Allies unilaterally decided to divide Korea without consulting the Koreans. And this was in contradiction of something called the Cairo Conference. So on September 8, 1945, Lieutenant General John Hodge of the United States arrived in Incheon to accept the Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. Appointed military governor, General Hodge directly controlled South Korea because the Japanese were running Korea at that time, pretty much. Controlled South Korea as head of the United States Army military government in Korea. He established control by restoring to power the key Japanese colonial administrators. So Korea was like a protectorate or mandate of Japan at the time, which is how we got in there. And he started the Korean police. The USA MGIK, or USA Magic, refused to recognize a provisional government of the short-lived People's Republic of Korea because he suspected it was communist. This we're talking about Hodge now. These policies, avoiding popular Korean sovereignty, provoked civil insurrections and guerrilla warfare. On the 3rd of September 1945, Lieutenant General Yoshio Kozuki, commander Japanese 17th Area Army, contacted Hodge, telling him that the Soviets were south of the 38th parallel at Kaesong. Hodge trusted the accuracy of the Japanese Army report. In December 1945, Korea was administered by United States Soviet Union Joint Commission, as agreed at the Moscow Conference in 1945. The Koreans were excluded from the talks. We're talking about their country. They can't even be there. The commission decided the country would become independent after a 5-year trusteeship action facilitated by each regime sharing its sponsor's ideology. So it's kind of like they're setting up shop. The United States get the South, the Russians get the North, set up the ideologies, turn them loose. What a great idea. The Korean populace revolted. In the South, some protested and rose in arms to contain them. USA MGIK, or USA Magic, banned strikes on December 8th, 1945, and outlawed the PRK Revolutionary Government and PRK People's Committees on 12 December 1945. So here we see a series of strikes, disorder, and so on. The war began in June of 1950, and the leader then, Kim Il-sung, traveled to Moscow and Beijing to secure support in a war with the South. Soviet military became extensively involved in North Korea's war planning, and of course, we were selling them all the equipment. The Truman administration was caught at a crossroads before the invasion. Korea was not included in the strategic Asian defense perimeter outlined by Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Military strategists were more concerned with the security of Europe against the Soviet Union and East Asia. At the same time, the administration was worried that a war in Korea would quickly widen into another world war should the Chinese or Soviets decide to get involved as well. Let it be on the public record that at the end of World War II, the Soviets and the Chinese had nothing. They had nothing. They had hardly any equipment at that time, and the equipment that they had was supplied by us. So the whole Cold War was a complete and utter sham. This was really a way to go in and to divide and conquer. Early on in the fighting, South Korea put its forces under the authority of the United Nations Command. So here we have one of the earliest examples of the intrusion of the United Nations in terms of being able to create conflict and strife. It's the first kind of United Nations officially sanctioned war. And here we are again, it's coming back around. Why? Because they never had a formal truce or surrender. None. That war is still open-ended, which is why we're dealing with all of this. It was interesting because a few weeks ago I was at Starbucks here in Austin, and I sat down, and there was this older guy sitting across from me, and he was talking. And you know how old people are sometimes? You think they're talking to themselves, right? Because they don't talk really loud enough. And I thought that this guy was just talking to himself. Well, apparently he was talking to me. And I was opening my computer, and he said, "You're going to make $1 million inside that thing." And I thought, well, that's interesting. I said, well, I hope so. I'd like to make rent this month inside that thing. He laughed, and we talked, and he was a veteran of the Korean War. And he told me that he suffered from PTSD after that war. And it's unfortunate because we have a whole group of veterans from that war that were never, ever recognized for doing what they did in a situation where they shouldn't have been in the first place. But it was, PTSD is an outgrowth of any war. But we usually associate it with things like Vietnam or even what's happened in the Middle East over the course of the last almost 15 years now. But it indeed happened in North Korea or the Korean War as well. So there's a little bit of a background behind the Korean War. What happens now? What happens if all of this is completely churned up and, for lack of a better term, fake? Right? What if the boogeyman in North Korea is just another Saddam Hussein? What if he's just another Muammar Gaddafi? Bark, no bite. Well, with all the rhetoric, what it does is it sets up something that perhaps is even darker than the actual threat itself. And that is the fact that things could happen here in this country that would be catastrophic or what's the word I'm looking for? Dangerous. And I think that's underselling it. Dangerous. And these things that could occur could be attributed to somebody like Kim Jong-un. If there's a nuclear explosion somewhere in the United States, and let's say it was planted there by some other group, they could say that it was Kim Jong-un that did it. And then we have kind of an interesting scenario that falls out from that event. Everything from going after Kim Jong-un to quarantining certain areas inside the United States that would make it difficult for people to live their lives on a daily basis. So the threat is in some ways even greater. The implied threat is in some ways greater than the actual threat itself, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with not just what it is, but what it could be. And anybody that has been tracking what's been happening in the world over the past 20 years understands that it is the implied threat that opens up a Pandora's box of dark and nefarious activities. And that's what we have to be aware of, in as much as the threat itself. I think that's where we just have to hold some space. The thing is now is that we've gotten so attuned to these things happening that two things are taking place. One is we're always kind of making space for the threat, holding it, right? Well, it's swine flu, hemorrhagic fever, Kim Jong-un. It's Muammar Gaddafi. It's the white guy. It's the young white guy on meds, the lone wing nut gunman with a gun. So we're always now having to kind of somehow hold the space for that kind of chaos, whether it's real or not, whether it's they're actors or it's theater. We're kind of holding space for that. And that takes up a lot of one's life and one's life force in the living. But we've been kind of trained to do it now, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to see things, we're trying to prevent things from happening in ways that they've happened in the past, and we're using our perceptions and our consciousness in order to do that.
Incoming call from 800.
Sorry about that. I hate that. And that's what we're dealing with. So what if we didn't do that? What if we just allowed it to be? What if we didn't have all of these feelings and all of these perceptions and all of these things that we're trying to work out and all this space that's taking up in our lives? Well, first of all, I may be out of a job. But besides that, it might be a much more healthy way. I mean, we're not talking about putting our heads in the sand, but rising above this chaos, this noise. Because I guarantee you, it's only going to get more chaotic and noisier. We're living in a time of really strange events. And this young guy from Korea who just partied with Dennis Rodman and the Harlem Globetrotters, going through his Saturn return, is threatening to wipe out cities in the United States. It doesn't get much weirder than that, does it? I don't think so. And then there'll be more. There's going to be more strangeness. So we have to figure out a way to deal with that. Because if we become inured by more and more strangeness and chaos and weirdness, then we become desensitized to it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because now we're not being moved around by every random insane event. But on the other hand, we also pay less attention to them. And therefore, the random insane events can become much more random and insane along the way. So it's a really interesting strategy to kind of figure out and embody in a time where I think it's going to get stranger and stranger and weirder. So as we are here on the heels of Easter, which is one of the biggest Christian holidays, that obviously Christmas that we experienced, it was interesting. I was watching TV on Saturday night, and what did they have on ABC? The 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston as Moses. And of course, the big event that comes out of the 10 Commandments as a religious observance is Passover. And that's happening on Easter Eve. Cruise down the cable spectrum. And then you get to, I think it might have been History Channel, or no, TNN. What do we have? We have the story of Barabbas, played by Billy Zane. That's on the night of Easter Eve. Barabbas and Moses. Nothing about Jesus. Now, I'm not a born-again Christian, so I'm not stumping for that. I'm just finding it interesting. I'm just taking notes that the most Christian of observances was really anything but Christian, at least on that night. But here we are in the heels of that, and one of the things that the Christians have is that they have faith. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. It doesn't matter what Kim Jong-un is going to do. It doesn't matter what Barack Obama is going to do. And in fact, anything that is done against a Christian is in some way identified as being a thing that brings them closer to God, faster to God. So any kind of suffering, any kind of domination or enslavement or anything along those lines is really a way for them to, redeem their sin and get closer to the source. It's an interesting strategy in terms of dealing with oppression. But the problem is that the oppression never goes away. And that we've been living with oppression on this planet for thousands of years, some of it overt, some of it covert. I mean, even here in the United States, while we have had some semblance of freedom, we've had some semblance of being able to pick and choose the type of lifestyle that we want based on economy and based on a fairly secured set of rights, it didn't stop other countries from practicing oppression. So somewhere in here is the mix. Somewhere in here are the elements with which we can deal with the strangeness without cutting ourselves off from our humanity, without completely shutting down to the point where we don't give a shit. Because a diet of nothing but strangeness is alienating. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to stay in the game and not be alienated. We're doing our best to live in this world, but not be of it. And Korea gives us another opportunity to do that. It gives us an opportunity to look at it, to see it, to experience it, to laugh at it, to marvel at it, to dissect it, to connect it, all those things. And at the end of the day, what's left? What's left is, how are you going to live your life from this moment forward? How are you going to treat other people? How are you going to treat yourself? Are you consistent? Are you congruent? Are you sovereign? Are you authentic? Are you dealing with people in the same way? Can you tap into your anger without exploding? Can you go beyond your anger? Can you have a whole panoply of emotions that are at your disposal and use them at any given point in time, depending upon what's moving your emotional body and what's moving your emotional frequency? That's what it's about. And all the other stuff, hopefully, should be, theoretically, an impetus or a device to get you to those places. Because if they're not, then all you're doing is being caught up in the high strangeness, the weirdness, the surreality of it all. And then you're sort of being knocked around and without being knocked around, like a boat without an anchor at that point, or without a rudder and an anchor too, depending on where you are. So at the end of the day, I hate that phrase. At the end of the day, at the end of this show, what are you going to do? How are you going to change your life? And keep moving forward in a time where it just really does not, the events of the world do not really support the moving forward. So I think that's where we are today. Be a fool. Live your life accordingly. Take risks for love. Take risks for adventure. And take risks to push yourself to levels of perception beyond those that you've had before. And do it with a smile on your face. This is Robert Phoenix. You've been listening to the Monday Mashup. I'll be back on Wednesday with Navigating the Astrological Matrix. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being in the chat room, each and every one of you. And have a happy, happy, happy April Fool's Day. Don't forget to laugh. Here's Philip K. Dick.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.